I mean, everything was pointing towards this. There's been a change in government, and perhaps this man was vulnerable, but also the court processes up until this point had been exhausted. And his last chance was his representations in January, and they were not successful. Your immediate reaction to the statement that was made, Makosini?
Look, I think this may very well be a good, decision to have been taken by Advocate Shaun Abrahams, but I really do not think that he had any choice. There was just no legal avenue for him to take any other decision. And he will take credit, of course, because he made the announcement, he took the decision and he made the announcement, but I don't think that he had any choice, really. I think legally everything was pointing to a decision being taken, even public interest, just public interest. There is an expectation out there on the side of the people, the general public, that all of us must be equal before the law, that if he has a case to answer, and nobody has ever said that the case is weak. The case was always, there was always a prima facie case. There may have been different views at one point or the other, but there was always a prosecutable case. And I think that it is a victory for constitutionalism, it is a victory for the rule of law in the country, and that all of us are equal before the law.
Aldrin, he gave us a hint of what was in those representations that President Zuma made. How different are those ones to the ones that he's made before? It sounds very much the same.
It certainly does sound the same. And even earlier on when Makosini was speaking about that suspicion that they had during your time in the NPA, and President Jacob Zuma, well then former Deputy President Jacob Zuma, accusing the NPA of leaking information to the media and vice versa, and this time around he's making the same allegations and saying that there has been these prosecutors who've been leaking this information to the media. Also spoke about impropriety from the prosecutorial side, and blaming, absolutely it seems though everyone, including their former NDPPs, including the former acting NDPPs. But quite interesting, I just quickly want to go back to the 2009 representation that he made at the time. One of his contentions, which is quite interesting, is that he said there's a risk of political, economic and social instability should the NPA proceed with his prosecution. This was back in 2009, and one then wonders that what could have changed now. Is that because at the time you were anticipating that you would be president, and now that you are not president, probably you feel that there couldn't be any political instability. Another issue that he raised at the time was President Zuma had this contention that the delays in finalizing the prosecution and the trial would undermine his right to a fair trial. That's exactly what he said just now as well.
Yeah.
All right. So does that suggest that they couldn't find actual law to back up their representations?
You know, I think this is now me speaking as a public relations strategist.
Right.
You know, when you have a matter in court and you also have to worry about the court of public opinion, usually you have the legal strategy being supported by the public relations strategy. But President Zuma does it the other way. He has a political strategy to deal with the charges. And the legal strategy just supports the political strategy. What is the political strategy? Play the victim, stretch this thing, the Stalingrad defense, that you question each and everything that is placed in front of you. And at the same time, you're galvanizing political support for yourself. So what is going to happen now is that as this NGO has filed an application for the permanent stay of prosecution, there's going to be that process. You put the charges here, he questions something. So he kicks the can right down the road up to a point where, if you do find a conviction, it will be 10 years from now. At that time, he's 85 years old, and not many people would want to see an old man in orange overalls. So his is a political strategy that is supported by a legal strategy. And you can see what is happening in KZN. The matter is going to be heard in KZN, and that's why he's more active politically. Most ANC presidents, when their time is done, they retreat from the ANC and become statesmen, as it were. That's what Nelson Mandela did to a very large extent. President Mbeki did the same. But President Zuma is involved in ANC structures, particularly in KZN, particularly in eThekwini, which is where the matter is going to be held. So that whenever he appears there, there's going to be some political support. There are going to be some people who are going to be saying, no, he's being prosecuted. You can expect that President Ramaphosa will be insulted and things like that. So in the end, you know, they may very well be other people who may see this as an opportunity for them to start some sort of disquiet, so that in the end to force the National Prosecuting Authority or the country to say maybe we don't need to proceed.
Legally, what happens from Monday? I mean, there will be, his lawyers will start to find ways to try and stymie the process, but in theory, what happens from Monday, and what is a possible timeline should all these legal games are dealt with timeously?
I think what is going to happen either way, he will have to present himself in court, you know, to be formally arraigned. And then from there, you know, his lawyers will have to make a call as to how they proceed with the matter, whether it's a permanent stay of prosecution application or dismissal of charges or anything like that. But appearing in court, he will appear at the Durban High Court as things appear, because he'll have to answer to the charges. He'll have to go and present himself in court. That's usually the procedure.
Does he get arrested at all?
No. No. He wouldn't be arrested. He wouldn't. I think he's just going to present himself in court. They will tell him when he must appear in court, and he'll just present himself in court. You place somebody under arrest and put them in handcuffs, either to stop them from committing a crime, or you want to make sure that they present themselves in court, or you feel that they're a flood risk, or they may do something that is undesirable. But in the case of a former head of state, someone who is protected by the state, there is that question doesn't arise. There will be anybody who has a desire of seeing him in handcuffs. They may disabuse themselves of that. It's not going to happen.
Uncharted water, Peter. It is uncharted water.
Right. And we will talk about what happens when he gets to trial. But the process that took us here, Shaun Abrahams talks about convening this team and them deciding and giving him a recommendation. Is that something that would have happened during your day when Vusipugole had to make the decision? So is this not an unusual process?
It's not very unusual. I mean, the prosecuting team has to have the biggest say, because they were in court. They prosecuted the matter when the national director was sitting in his office in Pretoria. And the alleged crimes were committed in KZN, so the director of public prosecutions for that jurisdiction will have to be involved, and the people who were members of the original prosecuting team, they will have to be involved. Of course, they would have to make recommendations to the national director, but the final decision is taken by the national director as to whether he prosecutes or not, given the magnitude and the public profile of the person involved and the matter itself, and how much it has gone through the hands of every NDPP that we've ever been, whether permanent or acting. So he had to take that decision, and he's taken that decision, and he announced it today.
All right, so perhaps we can clear up something as well. I was under the impression it was 18 charges, and he talked about representations being made on 16.
16 charges.
Is it 16 charges? Is it 18? Or he only dealt with 16 charges?
I think what could have happened, and I speak under correction here, is that after the representation was made, because remember that after the Supreme Court of Appeal upheld the High Court ruling, that meant that the 18 charges that were in the indictment that was served back in 2007 does remain. But after the representation was made and they looked at some of the charges, looked at some of the evidence, and probably looked at some of the witnesses that were available. I understand that the NPA, there was some report that all 213 witnesses that were listed at the time, all of them were available. That probably the prosecutorial team felt that actually not all 18 charges, let's rather go for the 16 charges, yes, and the 2 other charges fall away. And I just tweeted now, because we're not allowed to ask questions, yes, at the press briefing, we wouldn't know what the reasoning is behind that decision to let the 2 other charges fall away.
Yeah. But usually prosecutors want to take to court a case that they are confident they can win. If when they look at the charges and they review and they see that there are prospects that he can be acquitted on this charge, or it's not strong enough, they would usually drop it. So that's not unusual. But I think President Zuma has a mountain to climb. Because remember that Schabir Shaik has already been convicted, and I don't think they are buddies. I think their bromance is over now.
Do you think that Schabir Shaik would come in as a
well,
witness?
he did say that he was willing to, he was going to testify. He was quoted at some point.
He could be subpoenaed anyway.
He could be subpoenaed anyway, even if he's a hostile witness. I mean, he could be subpoenaed, but I think if you look at his own trials and tribulations, he can't be too happy with President Zuma at this time. And President Zuma is no longer President of the Republic, and therefore, his fair game to many people.
I was trying to read between the lines here, and there's representations. They said he lacked the requisite intention. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but it sounds as if he's saying, I took the money, but I didn't know what the money was for.
I think from the beginning, in the relationship that former President Zuma had with Schabir Shaik, it was always going to be about, he is my financial advisor. Okay, I'm financially illiterate. This is the man who's responsible for my finances. I don't know what he does. What I know is that my money goes into my bank account and he's responsible for everything. What he does, I don't know. I think that was always going to be his defense. But also, I think, given some of the things that are going to be spoken about, I think there is a possibility. For instance, with the fax, you remember that there was a fax where it was supposed to be confirmation of a bribe, etc. That, it's plausible that he can say he didn't know what was happening. Whatever signals he may have made, it meant something else and not what Schabir Shaik had said. But I think insofar as the totality and the whole picture, the big picture, I think he's got a mountain to climb in defending himself against these charges. They are just, I think, just too strong and too overwhelming.
The strange thing is that I actually thought that in his representation, because this was indicated in the statement from the presidency after the Supreme Court of Appeal ruling, that the president may be, quote unquote, interested in the Johan van der Walt matter, because Johan van der Walt is the auditor who compiled the report into the Schabir
KPMG,
from KPMG, who compiled the report that led to Schabir Shaik's conviction as well. But remember that many years later, and this is now last year, KPMG withdrew a report that was compiled by Johan van der Walt, and that report related to the SARS rogue unit. And the question was then, will President Jacob Zuma, when he makes representation, say that you can't rely on this man's evidence, he's been discredited already?
But you see, this is now where I think that is not very, I think it's disingenuous a defense, because at the end of the day, the court is the final arbiter of what is acceptable evidence and what is not acceptable evidence. Johan van der Walt's evidence got Schabir Shaik convicted. He appealed.
All the way.
All the way, until he had no choice but to go serve time in prison. So, I may have my own suspicions that if a metro cop pulls me on the side of the road and gives me a ticket, I may have my own, suspicions as to why he's picking on me. But if I've done something wrong, I've done something wrong.
So at the height of it all, it was about the timing of the prosecution, and we got a hint, and we were chatting about it just now. And I just wonder, Is that something that still carries on, where you actually have to sit and say, we must time this prosecution just right? This happened in the US recently. Hillary Clinton was running for office, FBI, I think it was, decided to release information that she was still not off the hook. And some people say she lost the election as a result of that.
The emails,
so it's crossing into politics. Does the NPA have to sometimes think about when to prosecute or when to issue an indictment? Or is it, listen, we'll do it tomorrow and that's it?
Look, I think I would be disingenuous if I said that public interest is completely ignored. That wouldn't be the truth. I don't think that to sit and say, okay, we've taken a decision to prosecute, but when do we make this announcement? If you make the announcement before the conference, then you might be seen to be trying to influence the conference. If you charge him after the conference, it could be that now, because your political master Thabo Mbeki has lost, now you are using the state institution to do what would stop this man becoming president of the country. So those decisions are always problematic. But in this particular instance, right now, it really doesn't arise anymore. He has been president. He's not president anymore. He was kicked out of office by his own political party for issues that are not related to this matter. Now his citizen, Jacob Zuma, he can be charged at any time. I don't think that the timing of the charges has any bearing on the political environment or any conversations that people might be having.
All right, so we're going to continue with this conversation shortly, but what we'd like to do is start moving around the country a little bit and get a sense of reaction